St. Peter's Basilica in Rome is one of the world's architectural marvels. It's not only that it's the largest church in the world, or that it's considered a model of Renaissance architecture, or the fact that it combines some of the best elements of ancient architecture from the Greek and Roman periods of that city. To walk into the structure today is to be astonished. The dome itself is a towering 448 feet inside, and the surface area inside the church covers over 227,000 square feet. The structure took more than 176 years to build, and even today boasts a daily visitation rate of between 40 and 50,000 people. The dome is illuminated at night and can be seen for miles all across the city of Rome. It's a landmark, and it symbolizes the permanent imprint that Christianity has left on this city, which is the beating heart of the Western Christian world. Or at least it was. However, what this church cost to create is equally staggering, and not just in financial terms. The church underwent a very lengthy construction and demolition process, as older structures that already existed on the site were gradually demolished and plans for the new structure were laid. It was in 1505 that Pope Julius II began to commission designs for the future building that was going to be erected in that location. Both Raphael and Michelangelo, luminaries of the Italian Renaissance, were involved in the plans that were submitted. 1 year later, in 1506, the first stone was laid. But the construction would be incredibly, nearly mind-bogglingly expensive. The cost at the time was something in the vicinity of 46 million ducats, and that was just for the construction. It doesn't account for any of the internal statues and tiles and other lavish ornamentation that currently adorn that structure. To put that in perspective, one Italian ducat converts to over $200 today. So if you're looking at 46 million ducats, and you do the math, you end up with a structure that costs billions in today's currency. And even now, the annual repair costs just to maintain the building are enormous. By the time the structure was complete in 1626, 176 years after the construction process had begun, the world into which this church would be born was unrecognizable. Western Christendom, the way it had looked when the idea or the plan for this church had been laid, had vanished, and nothing would ever be the same again. The reasons why that world had changed are in some ways tied up with the building of this church itself, and that is today's story. You're listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, and this is episode 2 in our series on the Protestant Reformation. If you haven't caught the first episode, it's out there already for you on John Wycliffe and medieval Christianity, the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation. And today we're going to continue that story, but we're moving away from Wycliffe now into a new chapter. If you haven't already subscribed, make sure you do so because there are further episodes coming, and this is going to be a very hefty, very detailed series. In our last episode, we covered the life of John Wycliffe, a medieval scholar from the 1300s. And Wycliffe is notable for having been an outspoken critic of the Christian church of his day. In particular, he raised concerns over the financial burdens that the church laid upon often the poorest members of society who were least able to pay, as well as the financial revenues that were being extracted from countries like England and funneled back into Rome, into the hands of the Pope. Wycliffe also pointed out that there were many people who held church offices. They were employees of the church. They were being paid to occupy those positions, but who had absolutely no concern for moral or spiritual matters. In other words, they weren't doing any part of the jobs they were being paid for. Wycliffe thought the church had become corrupted by wealth and power, and that the remedy for this was for the church to divest itself of the property and the financial benefits it had accrued over the centuries. He also thought that people should have access to the Bible in their own language, which was a radical idea at the time, and one that Wycliffe worked very hard to bring into reality by translating part of the Bible into English himself and overseeing a project to ensure the rest of the book was translated as well. Wycliffe did this because he thought that the verdicts or the rulings of the Pope and the doctrines of the Church could no longer be trusted. Essentially, he thought that many of the functionaries of the church, many of its teachings had become self-serving and much more focused on retaining the authority and the power of the church than actually giving people the moral and spiritual benefit that it should have been providing. Wycliffe was fortunate in that his ideas were convenient for the English royal family. And for more detail on that, you'll have to go back and listen to that episode. It's covered in great detail. But to summarize very briefly, members of the English royal family were fans of the idea that they could reduce the amount of taxes flowing out of England and into Italy, into the hands of the Pope. So if they could retain more of that in country and retain more of their autonomy, that was an idea they were willing to get behind. And so John Wycliffe himself was sheltered to a certain degree by very powerful friends in the royal family and the English aristocracy. He wasn't the only person to raise concerns about the church and to criticize some of the practices that had developed over time, but some of the others who were doing this weren't as fortunate as he was in their allies or patrons. So other critics often found themselves on trial in church courts for heresy. In 1415, a church council, the Council of Constance, examined some of the writings of John Wycliffe and declared that many statements, they pointed to particular examples, were heretical. And so anyone who agreed with these statements or spread these statements could also be guilty of heresy. Fortunately for Wycliffe, at this point he was already dead, so he wasn't in danger of being put on trial and burned at the stake as a heretic. But others weren't so lucky. Jan Hus of Bohemia and another reformer by the name of Jerome of Prague were interrogated by this church council, and they were actually asked specifically about whether or not they agreed with certain propositions from John Wycliffe's writings, in addition to being questioned about things that they themselves had said and written. Both men were ultimately burned at the stake after the verdict of the council found them to be heretics. Being a heretic was an extremely risky business. And so these particular individuals that we've mentioned paid for their ideas and they paid for their criticism with their lives. They weren't the only ones. And as you can imagine, a policy like this had a dampening effect on public criticism of the church, and that is exactly what was intended. Ironically, this Council of Constance in 1415 had been convened to deal with a scandal that was existing in the church that couldn't be denied. At the time, in recent memory, there had been no less than 3 popes at the same time, all claiming to be the proper occupant of the papal seat and the true leader of the Western Christian Church. Obviously, not all of them could be correct, and it was a scandal that there were 3 different candidates, each of whom had certain countries and certain communities that were willing to follow that candidate and not others. So this did a lot to undermine the authority of the church, to see this sort of fragmentation and fighting for the top office. So the council, among many tasks it had to perform, was in charge of trying to deal with the situation, to fix it, and to try and ensure that no such thing ever happened again. So they did focus a lot of time on the problem of the 3 popes, and also on other reforms that might be needed in the church. And then, of course, they found time to investigate and burn the 2 reformers that we've already mentioned. This council was more effective in suppressing dissent than it was in addressing the underlying problems that were causing these criticisms and these scandals. Those problems would persist with very explosive results, as we shall see. So in the wake of this scandalous period of three popes, the authority of the church is compromised, but this was only the latest episode in a long series of problems and issues that were causing increasing levels of resentment across Europe. And these are the conditions in which the Protestant Reformation, as it's come to be called, is going to take off. But let's first take a closer look at what some of these problems or resentments really were about. One of the major issues that caused a lot of criticism is known as the investiture problem. So this is sort of an arcane word for us these days. So to break it down, it looks like this. There were a number of offices, jobs, that the church would hire people for. And these jobs were called benefices. And there were three that were very common. You could be a parish priest, or you could be the abbot of a monastery or the abbess of a nunnery, or you could be a bishop, for example. These are not the only benefices, but they're some of the most common ones. So to get hired for this post, you would occupy that position and you would be paid wages for holding that position. Where did this money come from? It came from the tithes, the sort of tax that people paid to the church. So local people, farmers, artisans, merchants, shoemakers, they would be paying their 10% tax or tithe of their earnings to the church. And that money is where the wages for the parish priest and also a percentage of that for the bishop and so on would come from. Now, so far, so good. Each of these church offices involves an income stream for the person who holds it. But over time, it became possible for a single individual to hold multiple benefices or church jobs. And each of those had a paycheck attached to it. Now, obviously, if you were going to be a bishop in 3 different cities, you couldn't perform the duties of a bishop for all the different cities that were paying you to be their bishop. So there was a gap between payment and performance that became an ongoing problem. And a lot of communities would complain that, we're funding this position, but we never see the office holder. This person is absentee. They're just collecting the cash and they're not doing the job. Then there was another problem, which is who got to decide who would be appointed to these benefices or hired for these positions, essentially. And because they were church positions, ultimately the decision was supposed to reside with the church. However, the church was centered in Rome under the authority of the Pope, and its offices and its jobs were spread all over Europe. There were bishops in Germany and in France and in Bohemia and in Switzerland. And so in each of these areas, you had a local political ruler, a prince or a king or an emperor, who wanted the authority to decide for himself who got to be the bishop in the big cities in his territory. And so there was an ongoing tension between local rulers who wanted the authority to invest or appoint church officials in their territories, and the Pope who was saying, no, this is for me to decide. So this kind of friction developed, and there were instances where deals were made, where, for example, the Holy Roman Emperor could make a deal with the Pope that allowed him to appoint 200 of the benefices within his territory. So those became his decision, who to hire. And of course, that was great for the emperor or the king, as the case might be, because it gave him a reward, a plum position that he could hand out to someone that he wanted to reward. It also increased the loyalty of church officials within his territory to the crown or the king. It's not hard to see why local rulers would be interested in that kind of a deal. The problem, of course, was experienced by the people who were under that religious office holder, the people who were supposed to be dealing with this parish priest or this bishop. Because to be appointed to an office like this, you didn't even have to be a religious person. It was possible to secure a benefice or a job within the church if you paid money to the right people, and you could get your son appointed to one of these offices. And so he would have a great job, a great income source for the rest of his life, potentially. But not only did he not have to be in the community where he was being paid, but he didn't even have to have any particular interest or knowledge in religious matters. So with problems like this going on in the structure of the church itself, it's not hard to see why the experience for the everyday man who was on the receiving end of church services declined dramatically, and why church office holders were often regarded as people who were just interested in money and in collecting and being paid by others without actually doing anything that created value. So in addition to these benefice and investiture problems, there were other issues of corruption around money. People complained that in the Roman Curia, or the officials around the Pope in Rome, that you could get sort of a religious exemption for pretty much any sin you had committed, as long as you were willing to pay whatever price was named, and that church officials were happy to hand out religious dispensations and sort of get out of hell free cards as long as you paid a certain amount of money. And it wasn't limited to the officials around the Pope either. It was expected that fees and bribes would be paid to church officials if you wanted to be promoted in the church. So if you were a bishop and you wanted to be a cardinal, there would be some greasing of the hierarchy that was required. And so many times people would pay to get appointed to their first benefice or church office. And then if they wanted to get promoted, they would be paying again. So there was sort of bribery and lubrication inside the system, but there was also the expectation of bribes and payment when services were provided to everyday people outside the system as well. And the Pope could also create new church offices at will, and some of them did, which people would then happily pay to occupy. So sort of with a snap of one's fingers, these new jobs are invented, and then there are now additional streams of revenue that are coming into Rome. So a lot of people noticed this and complained about it, perhaps not very, very loudly, but the murmurs of discontent were incredibly widespread across Europe because this had been going on now for several centuries. Corruption and immorality had reached even down to the ground floor, sort of the lowest entry-level positions in the church. Your everyday parish priest, or your friar, who was a traveling preacher who would go from community to community, and the monks and nuns who lived in cloistered communities as well. 14th century Dominican friar John Bromyard said of his colleagues, quote, "Those who should be the fathers of the poor covet delicate food and enjoy morning sleep. Very few vouchsafe their presence at matins or mass. They are consumed in gluttony and drunkenness, not to say in uncleanliness, so that now the assemblies of clerics are thought to be brothels of wanton folk and congregations of play actors," unquote. So John Bromyard is writing in the 14th century. This means he's a contemporary of John Wycliffe. He's living in the 1300s, the 14th century. So he's complaining about these things back then. They've continued for another couple of centuries. But what Bromyard is saying is actually a lot more damning than it might sound to us. So as a friar, you are a full-time preacher. You are supposed to be celibate. You're supposed to have dedicated your life to God. You're supposed to be traveling from community to community, preaching, performing spiritual services for people, and living off donations or alms. That's the idea. What Bromyard is saying here is that these people are essentially sleeping in, they're eating rich food, they're not living off donations. They don't even go to church services, so they have very, very almost non-existent personal piety. They're busy getting drunk, and when he says uncleanliness, he doesn't mean they didn't wash well. He means they're busy having all kinds of sex that they shouldn't be having. So saying that assemblies of churchmen are thought to be brothels is a very damning indictment of the way that this guy was an employee of the church. He was a friar himself. He was on the inside. This wasn't a shoemaker or a farmer who was saying, why am I paying money to these people? This guy was on the inside of the structure, and this is what he had to say. So it gives you a sense of the temperature of resentment and the seriousness of the problems that were being observed across Europe. Local priests in many communities had taken to asking for extra fees to perform the daily services that they were supposed to be doing as part of their jobs. Things like baptisms and weddings and funerals. That's the work of a parish priest, and conducting mass, right? But in many communities, these priests were now saying, oh, you want me to baptize your child? That's going to cost you this much money. These are things that were sort of bread and butter things parish priests were supposed to do as part of their jobs. And so when the local priest was saying, oh, you'd like me to baptize your baby? That's going to cost you this much money. This is on top of the tithes that ordinary people are already paying. So it caused a lot of resentment when people were now being asked for extra money for services that were supposed to be included in what they were already paying for. You might think, what's the big deal? People charging money for these ceremonies, couldn't you just skip the ceremony if you didn't want to pay? The answer is no. When we're talking about Christianity in the Middle Ages and through the Renaissance, these rituals and these sacraments, things like baptism and last rites, were considered absolutely essential for the future of your immortal soul. If you didn't baptize your baby and that child died, it was going straight to hell. That was the belief. So skipping a baptism wasn't an option. Saving that money wasn't possible. So people definitely needed this baptism. It was something that had to be done. And so when extra money was now being asked, it felt like extortion. They felt like they were being held over a barrel. I have to baptize this baby. I have to do it now. And you're telling me it's going to cost me even more money? Where is this money going to come from? A lot of these people are peasants. They're serfs. They're poor artisans. They don't have a lot of money, and they resent being asked for more for these services that they thought they had already paid a priest to provide. Now, why are the priests asking for more money? It's because they're under more pressure from Rome to remit a larger portion of the community tithes back to Italy. And so there's less left for them, and they're trying to make up the gap by now charging these extra fees. Some priests even paid a concubinage fee to their overseeing bishop, to their boss. What was this? It was a fee that was paid so that that priest could have essentially a common law partner, a woman who would live with him and be essentially a spouse, even though they didn't have a church-recognized marriage of any kind. This was a problem because priests were supposed to be celibate. They were supposed to be not having sex with anybody. So to have this system where a priest could just pay a fee and then have a partner was a very flagrant violation of what was expected of priests. But surprisingly, a lot of communities weren't that upset about it because they thought that if at least the priest had a woman, he might be less likely to seduce our wives and daughters, which was another problem that was ongoing in a lot of communities. So the respect for the office and the belief in sort of the moral uprightness of the office holders in the church was very low. That was the issue, and it had been going on for several centuries by the time our story really gets going. There was this widespread attitude of anti-clericalism, or, against the church, resentment for the church across Europe in the 1500s. So this is where our narrative takes off. John Wycliffe was 1300s, so 200 years later, things haven't gotten better. If anything, they've gotten worse. And famous humanist scholar Desiderius Erasmus, who lives at this period, notes that to call someone a priest or a friar, a churchman, is almost a term of abuse. That's how low the estimation is in the eyes of most people for the people who occupy church offices. It's in this environment that the ideas of Martin Luther would take off with all the fury of a wildfire after a drought. Martin Luther, the man whose name has become synonymous with the Protestant Reformation, was born into an average, almost working class family in Germany. He's not to be confused with Martin Luther King, who is an African-American activist, so totally different character. This man is a boy born in Germany, and his father works in mining. His mother comes from a middle-class family, but ends up doing things like carrying firewood on her back to get fuel into the family home to warm it up. So they're not incredibly wealthy people. They're a very hardworking family, and there are 8 children in the Luther family. Young Martin showed signs of intelligence at an early age. And so his parents, even though they weren't wealthy, made the decision that they were going to sacrifice financially to fund his education. And they save and they work and they save and they work, and they send young Martin through the education system of his day. This was a significant burden for them. He had to go through grammar school and middle school, and eventually they send him to the best university in the area, the University of Erfurt, which has a fantastic law school. And this is because Martin Luther's father, Hans, aspires for his son to become a lawyer, which was then, as it is now, a lucrative position, and one which brings with it a certain degree of social respect. And so there's this upwardly mobile ambition that's expressed by Hans Luther for his young son, and he's willing to work extremely hard to give his son this opportunity. Young Martin had gone through university. He'd achieved his bachelor's degree and his master's degree by 1505. He was on track for a career in law when something shocking happened. The story goes that Martin Luther is a young man. He's 22 years old. He's walking through the countryside, immersed in thought, and suddenly it's a summer afternoon, and there's one of those late afternoon thunderstorms that breaks open above his head. And so very suddenly there's thunder and there's lightning, and the story goes that a lightning bolt comes down frighteningly near young Martin. There's no cover around, and he's terrified. He thinks that he might be hit by lightning. He's going to die. And so he cries out and he prays to Saint Anne, who is a popular saint in that community at the time, reputed to be the mother of Mary, who's the mother of Jesus in Christian lore. And so Martin Luther cries out to this saint and he says, "Saint Anne, save me. And if you do, I promise I'll dedicate my life to God. I'll become a monk." So the thunderstorm passes. Martin Luther is still alive, and he makes good on his promise. Within 2 weeks, he turns up at an Augustinian monastery, and he signs up to be a monk. Now, this didn't come out of nowhere, obviously. There are signs that young Martin wasn't enthusiastic about a career in law, but he knew it was what his father wanted for him. So he was dutifully going through the educational process, and he received a very expensive legal manual that his father paid for as a gift, to mark his entry into the profession. But he wasn't enthusiastic about it. He wasn't excited about it. It's fairly certain that Martin Luther already had reservations about going into a career in law, but was wary of displeasing his father, who had sacrificed so much for this. And so, with an existing desire in his mind already to go into the monastic or the religious life, this moment when he cries out in fear is sort of an excuse to go where he would rather have gone anyway. More cynical historians like to say that the entire episode, "Look, Dad, I made a vow to Saint Anne. I have to go do this now," could have been a well-calculated strategy on young Martin's part to sort of get out of a career that he didn't really want to begin with. From what I've read about Martin Luther, he seems, if anything, incredibly sincere and incredibly intense. So to me, it's entirely plausible that he had his own personal desires for a more spiritual monastic life, was afraid to displease his father, and genuinely did make this promise, which then he fulfilled. So how cynical how cynical you think Martin was with this account is sort of open to interpretation. But in any case, he goes to the monastery within 2 weeks. He turns himself in. His career in law, it's finished. And by all accounts, his father never forgave him for the shocking disappointment. Martin Luther's father, like many Germans at the time, thought that a church career was disreputable and that these monks and priests were doing absolutely nothing of value. And so he would have been incredibly disdainful and sorry to see his son wasted in such an institution doing such a job. If only Luther Sr. had known that the son he seemed to lose to the monastic life would soon be the reason for the complete crumbling of monastic life across Europe, he might not have felt quite so upset about it. For the next 12 years, from 1507 to 1517, Martin Luther applied himself zealously to being the best Augustinian monk he possibly could. The monastery that he'd signed up for wasn't one of those late-sleeping, gluttonous, brothel-like institutions that we heard criticism about earlier. This was a very austere, very serious place. And Martin Luther was going through all of the intensity of the monastic life. This meant getting up early. It meant ritual prayers multiple times a day. It meant subsisting on, very frequently, a bread and water diet, or water and extremely simple, poor foods. It meant being clothed in rough garments, going around barefoot. It meant a life of intense study, because Martin Luther's intelligence was recognized by his contemporaries wherever he went. And so they, in the church, encouraged him to continue his education, but this time now to pursue a doctoral degree in theology, which he did. First, of course, as part of his journey through the system, young Martin Luther was ordained as a priest, so he now had the authority to perform all the duties that a priest would, and he was then encouraged to go further and get essentially the equivalent of a PhD in the theory and study of the nature of God, which is what theology is. He was even asked to take a chair teaching biblical studies at the University of Wittenberg. So it's not just that he had his PhD in the subject, but he was then going to hold a very authoritative position teaching in this university, all of this before the age of 30. Despite Luther's unstinting dedication to the demands of monastic life, and the fact that in his letters and his statements he frequently seems burned out, at the end of his energy, he wasn't able to find any kind of spiritual peace. Whatever he did, Luther said it never felt like enough. And he was absolutely tortured by the idea that he was still full of sin and that he hadn't satisfied God. And he would confess compulsively to the man in charge of hearing his confessions, to the point where his confessor, his overseer, would say, Luther, I don't know what it is you think you've done wrong today, but it doesn't sound like there's much there. But Luther would be busy scouring his soul and his thoughts and his impulses for any sense of impurity or sin or wrongdoing. His confessor advised more moderation and less self-abnegation, but Luther did all the penances and the prayers and the religious exercises that were assigned to him with absolute punctilious attention to detail, to the point where if he had to teach for several hours and therefore miss some of the ritual prayers, he would count them up and sometimes spend 6 hours at a time on the weekend making up for the missed ritual prayers or exercises he should have done while he was teaching or doing some other required task. After all of this, after 12 long years of being obsessed with performing down to the smallest detail every religious duty that was required of him, Luther still had no satisfaction, no sense of peace, no sense of being right before God. And he finally concluded that if the system of religious observance and exercises hadn't worked for him, that it wouldn't work for anybody. Because he looked around at his contemporaries and he was aware that many of them weren't trying as hard as he was. So after feeling like he'd spared absolutely no effort, if he still wasn't where he was supposed to be, then he concluded there was something wrong with the system itself. Now, Luther's epiphany, or his moment of sort of illumination, came while he was preparing lecture notes for one of his many lectures at the university in biblical studies. So he was preparing basically a lesson. He was going to be lecturing students, and he was going over verses in the Bible. And suddenly the lights turn on for him. Now, you might be wondering, why would someone who has a PhD in theology suddenly be amazed because they were looking at some Bible verses? Isn't that what they did all the time? The answer is no, or at least not at this point in history. At this time, people who were studying theology spent a lot of their time reading commentaries or writings of church fathers, other figures who had been foundational for the development of church teaching and thinking about God. People like Augustine or St. Jerome. So there was a lot of reading about the theological doctrines that had been developed, but not a lot of reading from the text itself. And one of the reasons for this is that the printing press is just about to emerge. So the documents that are available are mostly hand-copied manuscripts. But the other reason is that the Bible itself was treated more like a sacred object. And so people studied the sort of body of traditions and writings that had grown up around it, but the object itself was often kept in a beautiful box and guarded and sort of revered, but not really opened up and read as much as you would think. The text of the Bible was closely guarded and hard to access. So Luther is now at the point where he is able to access one of these copies, and he's going over the text itself directly. And as he does that, he has this moment where everything shifts for him. So according to Luther, he was studying the words of Paul in the book of Romans, chapter 1, verse 17, where it says, "The just shall live by faith." And these words began to sort of echo and resound in Luther's mind as the answer to the problem that had bedeviled him for so many years. In his own account, Luther says he realized that his efforts to please God by doing the requisite number of ritual prayers or repetitions or penances, all of these efforts on his part were basically irrelevant. It wasn't that trying to be good was unimportant, but that tallying up the exact number of ritual prayers or penances to sort of balance the moral ledger was futile. According to Luther's own account, what he began to realize was that God simply took the moral perfection of Jesus and covered individual humans with it. Basically, took that credit and assigned it to your individual moral account. That there was a promise that God had done exactly this. So trying to add up the number of moral merit points yourself wasn't necessary. The account had already been settled, and that what Luther was required to do, what all of us were required to do, according to his reading of this verse, was to live believing in this promise, that our moral account sheets had already been balanced, that the debt had been paid. And so this was what he was called to do, to live by faith, to live believing this promise had already been fulfilled. Once Luther reached this conclusion, many of the moral practices that he'd grown up with, the ritual prayers, the penances, the pilgrimages, all of these simply fell away as not necessary. He saw these activities as people trying to earn spiritual credit through their own activity instead of believing that the moral balance had already been transferred. Now, this realization, or this moment when he's looking at this verse, didn't crystallize all of Luther's thinking at once. It was a moment that began to gel a series of thoughts which lie at the heart of what would become known as the Protestant Reformation. It begins the train of thought that Luther will develop over subsequent years with many different statements and teachings, where he takes these ideas to their logical conclusions, and these conclusions will overhaul everything about Christianity as he knew it. Luther's ideas took years to develop. But the moment that these ideas left the privacy of his mind and entered the visibility of public space is a moment that's become sort of the subject of legend. And it's the famous incident of the 95 Theses. So what are 95 Theses? These were a list of propositions or statements, essentially, that Luther was proposing for debate. So this was a list of statements, many of them critical of existing church practice. And Luther writes up these statements in this one document, and legend has it he's striding through the streets of Wittenberg, and he goes up to the church door and nails this document to the church door. And he does this on October 31st. Which you and I think of as Halloween or All Hallows Eve, but Protestants have commemorated this day as Reformation Day, or the day that the Protestant Reformation begins with sort of the publication of this document. It's a good story, but it's not entirely accurate. It's highly unlikely that scholars don't think that Luther went and actually nailed this document to the church door. He probably posted it on a sort of academic notice board, as something that he's proposing for public debate, and there wasn't a lot of interest amongst the scholars of his day. Nobody took him up on this and said, yes, let's debate these propositions in public. It was sort of a non-event. Why the 95 Theses became famous was that they were sent to a printing press. And when that happened, and these statements criticizing existing church practices were printed on this new technology, they could be widely disseminated and read by all kinds of people, not just the academic scholars that would have debated them, but the everyday person. And they resonated because of the resentment that people felt for the way that the church institutions were operating. So when they read these criticisms, it took off. People were passing them around, they were reading them, they were talking about them. That's why the document becomes famous. So why is Luther writing out these criticisms at this particular moment in the year 1517? Well, the issue that had galvanized him into action goes right back to St. Peter's Basilica, which we started today's episode with. The Pope was busy trying to build this enormous church. They had these beautiful architectural designs submitted by Michelangelo and Raphael, and now trying to build this into reality was going to be a very expensive project. So how to raise the extra money to build this church? The Pope had sent his agents or employees across Europe charged with raising funds for this very special project. These fundraisers were hawking spiritual benefits in exchange for cash. Let me explain. In the 1500s, these spiritual benefits that you could purchase for money were known as indulgences. An indulgence was essentially a piece of paper that was written up. It had the stamp of the church on it, and it could be purchased. Why would you want to purchase one of these pieces of paper? Well, it was based on a complicated theory. This theory emerges in the 11th and 12th centuries. So this is a good 3 or 4 centuries before the moment of Martin Luther getting really upset about this. But the theory that had developed in the high Middle Ages, 11th and 12th centuries, went something like this. If you did something wrong, if you committed a sin, you needed to go to the local priest and confess. And when you did that, he would assign you penance. So you needed to repent. You need to say, I'm really sorry. I did this terrible thing. I'll never do it again. And the priest would say, okay, this is what you need to do. You need to say these prayers and you need to do some act to show your repentance. Maybe you need to donate a certain amount of money or, you need to perform this service or whatever it was. All sin in church thinking is punishable by hellfire. So if you did the right thing about your sin, you confessed it, you prayed about it, you did penance, then you wouldn't be going to hell. But there would still be a penalty that was incurred for doing that wrong act. And you could offset some of that penalty, but there would be a remaining balance to be paid. And where was that paid? It was paid in a place called purgatory. So purgatory is an idea that develops around this time, and there are different theories about who came up with it and why, but there is no notion of purgatory in the early church. It's not mentioned in the writings of Augustine, for example. But it comes out during the Middle Ages. So the idea is that if you're a saint, if you're morally perfect, then when you die, you go straight to heaven. And if you're a wicked person, then when you die, you go straight to hell. But most people are between these extremes. They're neither morally perfect nor irredeemably wicked. They've done some good things, they've done some bad things, they've maybe felt sorry and repented for some of the bad things they've done. So when they die, they go to purgatory. And in purgatory, they're in torment, they're in flames. But the good news is that it's not permanent. They stay in purgatory to be cleansed by this punishment, to pay the penalty for their existing moral balance sheet. And when that burden of suffering is paid, then they get out of purgatory and they go into heaven. Okay, so people are worried about how long they're going to spend suffering flames in purgatory. Here's where indulgences come in. The teaching of the church at this time was that the moral benefit, the moral credit, if you like, that had been earned by Jesus Christ and the saints was collected in a sort of moral treasure chest, a treasury of moral credit that the church had the keys to. So these people, the saints, had earned more spiritual credit than they needed for their own passage to heaven. And so this excess moral credit was sitting left over in the account. And the church could assign some of that existing moral credit to you to pay off your own existing balance, at least in part. So if you got some of this moral credit assigned to you, there's less moral debt you have to pay off in purgatory, less suffering for you. And how can you get this credit assigned to your account? You can buy an indulgence. So if you purchased an indulgence, you could decrease the amount of debt you had to pay off in purgatory. Now, in theory, this buying of an indulgence still had to be accompanied by true repentance and an attempt to reform your life. That was, the teaching originally included that. But as this offer was popularized and was spread out across Europe, and these fundraisers were going out trying to sell indulgences, the moral part of the transaction got lost. That message didn't get transmitted. What people were hearing was, buy this indulgence and get rid of the penalty for lying or committing adultery or stealing or whatever was the bad thing you had done. So you could pay cash and get a moral benefit that wiped out the penalty for your bad deed. The simplifying of this message was also motivated by the fact that many indulgence sellers, who were often traveling friars, these were the ones commissioned by the Pope to sell indulgences and raise these funds, a lot of these indulgence sellers got to keep a percentage of every indulgence they sold. So they had an incentive to make the sale easy. Let's make the sales pitch really simple. Pay this money, get this benefit. And that's what was going on. The slogan was simple: buy an indulgence and erase your sin. Financial gain, both for the friars that were hawking them and for the Pope, who ultimately was trying to raise funds, became the dominant goal rather than the moral improvement of individuals. This sale of indulgences had been going on for a couple of centuries, so it wasn't like a totally new idea that the Pope came up with in the 1500s to pay for St. Peter's. Selling of indulgences for various projects and purposes had been going on for a while, and educated men were disgusted at this. Men who took religion seriously, who were literate, who thought about these things, saw this for what it was, which was essentially a shameless money grab, an exploitation of the poorer and the more simple folk to extract money from them that they could ill afford to spare. Already paying their tithe to their local priest or bishop, already paying extra fees for the performance of basic services, and now being asked for more money to pay for these extra moral benefits. The indulgence sellers had become so shameless that in 1450, some 70 years before Martin Luther, Thomas Gascoigne, the Chancellor of Oxford University, wrote the following, quote, "These indulgence mongers wander over the country and give a letter of pardon, sometimes for 2 pence, sometimes for a draught of wine or beer, or even for the hire of a prostitute for carnal love. So you can imagine the disgust of people like this chancellor. He's like, here come these indulgence sellers, and they're saying, oh, I'm going to hire a prostitute and I'm going to pay her by giving her this letter. Or I'd like to buy some wine. Here, have an indulgence and I'll take the wine. So the trade in these things had become so debased and so without any kind of moral weight at all that it was disgusting. To make matters worse, by the 1500s, local princes or rulers would often only allow indulgences to be sold in their territories if they got a cut of the sales. And that cut could be up to 2/3 of the proceeds. So everyone wanted in on this. The Pope was getting paid, the indulgence seller got a cut, and your local political ruler also got his piece of the pie. So in the 1500s, when Luther is thinking about these things, a new indulgence campaign is rolling out because the Pope needs to raise a lot of extra money to build St. Peter's. In order to increase the amount of money that's going to be earned in this campaign, they expand the offer. So now you can buy an indulgence not just to cover your own moral debt, you can buy an indulgence for your dead loved ones who are already suffering in purgatory. Obviously, this greatly expanded the potential market and the number of sales that you could make. And there was a Dominican friar by the name of Johann Tetzel who was in charge of leading the indulgence sales in Germany. And he was a shameless salesman. He basically painted these lurid pictures for people of their dead loved ones crying out in the torments of purgatorial fire, roasting in the flames, and holding out their hands piteously to the living, begging for some kind of mercy. Can't you help us? Didn't we spend our entire lives taking care of you, say your dead parents? According to Tetzel. Will you now leave your parents suffering in the flames of purgatory? No. Buy this indulgence and shorten their suffering. Get your mother out of purgatory today. We have a special deal for you. So this was a way of dramatically expanding the sales, and it exploited people's emotions and their emotional connection to those that they had loved and lost. Tetzel coined the slogan, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." That was the sales pitch. Now, this was exactly the kind of activity that Martin Luther deemed to be not just useless, but deeply dangerous. According to him, people were now under the idea that they could simply pay money that they could ill afford to spare, for benefits that Luther regarded as totally imaginary. Even worse, they were under the impression that these pieces of paper they had purchased were actually going to be of moral benefit for them, instead of the actual attitudes and repentance that Luther would deem necessary for the salvation of their souls. So initially, when Luther is writing these 95 Theses, or these propositions, he's framing his criticisms as those of a loyal son of the church. He's an inside man. He's spent the last 12 years of his life giving all of his energy to the church. And so he's saying, listen, there are these problems, there are these abuses, we need to fix them. Luther framed it as bringing to the Pope's attention abusive practices that were being done in the Pope's name, which, if the Pope only knew about them, he would surely disapprove of them and put an end to them. That was how he framed it. Once the document went to the printing press and began to circulate widely amongst an increasingly literate population in Germany, Luther had articulated things that people also resented and felt a great deal of anger about, but were reluctant to say in public or to put in writing. And so there was a lot of traction that this piece of paper, that Luther's 95 Theses, attracted immediately because many other people were upset about exactly the same things. Now, Johann Tetzel and the other Dominican friars who were running the campaign in Germany were quick to howl when they saw Luther's theses being printed and reproduced. They were saying that Luther was a heretic and he should be tried in Rome and burned at the stake. because the Dominicans were a very powerful order, and they were used to shutting down and silencing anybody who questioned their authority. They were the Pope's men. Whatever they did was in the Pope's name, and you got in the way at your peril. So they thought that they could use the usual tactics to get rid of this Martin Luther and silence his annoying and inconvenient criticisms. So Tetzel and others began to write and publish and print increasingly heated criticisms of Luther, and then Luther fires back. I mean, he has a way with a pen. He's incredibly well educated. He knows his material. And so he's on very firm ground when he's talking about what is justified and what is not justified in terms of church practice. This is his area of specialization. And so he writes these fiery responses, which are also printed and circulated. So there's a war of words, or a duel of pens that's happening through the printing press, and people are reading these competing ideas going back and forth. The great thing about these sort of exchanges was that they were in the form of pamphlets or open letters. So they were really easy to print and read. It didn't take a long time for the printer to set that up and run it off the press. And it was very easy for people to kind of purchase and digest. It was a quick read. And so these things made money, and they were therefore printed in increasing numbers and circulated widely across Europe in the months after Luther's initial 95 Theses were sent out. By 1518, so only a few months later, if we think that Luther puts his theses out in October-ish of 1517 or a little bit later, it's only a few months later in 1518 that the Pope sends word to the head of the Augustinian order in Germany, which is Luther's monkish order, that Luther's a heretic. He should be seized and thrown into prison and detained there until he can be transferred to Rome for trial. So at this point, it becomes obvious that the Pope is aware of some of the practices that have been going on and isn't sympathetic to Luther's criticism. At this point, Martin Luther turns to a powerful prince. In fact, he's the ruler of the territory that Martin Luther lives in, and his name is Prince Frederick of Saxony, sometimes called Frederick the Elector or Frederick the Wise. So he's the prince who rules this particular domain that Luther lives in, because Germany at the time is not a nation state the way it is today. It's a collection of duchies and kingdoms and principalities, each of which has its own ruling noble, and they have these relations with each other, as well as their own domains. So Luther appeals to the highest political authority where he lives, which is Prince Frederick, who's also the man who created the University of Wittenberg and was happy to hire Luther to work there, and has a personal interest in Luther because Luther's scholarship and his increasing reputation has basically put the University of Wittenberg on the map. And students are beginning to travel to Wittenberg to study under Luther. And this is a trend that's only going to increase after the 95 Theses really take off. So Frederick has an interest in keeping Luther exactly where he is, even though there's no evidence that Frederick himself was a passionate reformer who thought that there were all kinds of things wrong with the church. He was a man who could see that Martin Luther brought benefit to his institution, the university. So Martin Luther is asking Frederick for shelter, to keep him in Frederick's territory, because Luther knows that if he's transferred to Rome, he's going to die a hideous death. He's going to be interrogated, he's going to be tortured, and eventually burned at the stake. If he's very lucky and says the right words, he might get the privilege of strangulation before he's burned, but many heretics were burned alive. It's an awful and drawn-out way to die. So it's not hard to understand why Luther was looking for ways to avoid this. Frederick agrees to provide shelter, and because the Pope is in a political position for complicated dynastic reasons that he needs to stay on Frederick's good side, the Pope basically allows Frederick's request that Martin Luther stay in Frederick's territory, and any interrogation or trial of Martin Luther happens on Frederick's turf. The Pope wants to keep Frederick happy, so he agrees to this request. The Pope sends his representative, a man named Cardinal Cajetan, to the city of Augsburg, in Frederick's territory. And this cardinal is now going to interrogate Martin Luther and try to bring him back to the fold, away from heretical teachings and into obedience to the Pope. The cardinal's main objective was to get Luther to admit that the Pope did have the power to shorten the suffering of souls in purgatory, because this was one of the major criticisms Luther had made in his 95 Theses, saying, the Pope doesn't have the power to get anyone out of purgatory. And if he did, why doesn't he just rescue everybody if he has the credit? Why would he leave people suffering there? So Luther was sort of ridiculing this idea that the Pope had this ability. And this teaching was the foundation of all indulgence sales. If you didn't believe that the Pope could assign moral credit to shorten your time in purgatory, then there'd be no reason to buy any indulgences, and that would be a huge revenue loss. So Luther has this interview. He's brought in to see the cardinal. The cardinal demands that he publicly acknowledge that the Pope has this power. And Luther says, no, I'm not going to agree with that. I don't believe it. I think it's false. Now, Luther argues that there's no basis in the Bible for this idea of purgatory and the Pope's power to remove people from it. But this is an astonishing line of reasoning. It may not sound astonishing to you and I, but that's because we live in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. And so many of the ideas that were radical and shocking at the time they were first uttered have become the furniture around us that we don't even notice anymore. In Luther's time, the church was built on the idea that the Pope defined right practice and right belief. He was the source of authority for what Christianity was and what it wasn't, what were correct ideas and what were heretical ones. If the Holy Father, the Pope, made a statement about the faith, it should be automatically accepted as truth simply because of his office. The idea that you could quarrel with something the Pope had said based on your own reading of the Bible was a radical assertion, but this was exactly what Luther was arguing. He was in effect saying there is a different source of authority for what Christian practice and belief is and isn't. This source of authority is higher than the Pope, and the Pope can be measured against it. This source of authority is the text of the Bible itself. So the cardinal repeatedly and angrily demands that Luther just accept the authority of the Pope, because the Pope was in charge of telling people what the Bible meant. And so the cardinal is saying, you have to acknowledge his position. And Luther is saying, show me in the Bible where my reasoning has gone wrong. So they were essentially speaking two different languages. The cardinal was speaking the language of institutional authority, which was the only source for Christian teaching in the world at the time. And Luther was arguing for a very different structure. He was saying that the source of Christian teaching and doctrine is in this text, and the institutional structures and authority don't matter. Needless to say, there was no understanding, consensus, or agreement that was reached, and Luther essentially left the interview in disgust. In doing this, he had showed disrespect to the Pope's representative, and through that representative to the Pope himself. At this point, everyone expected that the cardinal was going to forcibly seize Luther and drag him off to Rome for trial and execution as a heretic. Luther didn't live in Augsburg, obviously. He lived in Wittenberg at the university. So he traveled from his home to this city of Augsburg for this interview, and then he had to return. So his friends were afraid that at some point during this journey, he would be snatched by agents of this cardinal, kidnapped, and taken off to Rome, despite this promise he'd been given of safety on this travel. So his friends were unwilling to trust in the promise of safety, and they therefore smuggled Luther out of the city in the middle of the night. It was one of these dramatic exits where he was in disguise and going through a crack in the wall and put on a horse and galloping off into the night so that no one would know where he was and he would escape any potential kidnappers. Now that Luther's defiance of the Pope was open and direct, everyone knew that there was going to be some kind of retribution. The Pope might choose to punish Frederick, the prince, and the entire community that was sheltering Luther. He might lay some penalty on them. And so, because Luther was aware of this, he actually wrote a letter to Prince Frederick, and he said, listen, maybe I should leave. because if I stay here, then the consequences of my actions might affect you. And Frederick is initially inclined to accept this offer. He actually writes a letter to Luther saying, yes, you should leave. But the same day, or almost immediately afterward, writes another letter retracting that. So these two letters arrive almost simultaneously. And in the second letter, Frederick says, actually, stay. And he decides in this moment that he's going to continue to provide shelter no matter what consequences the Pope might inflict. So Frederick tells the Pope that unless he, the prince, is provided with proof of Luther's heretical teaching, Luther's going to stay exactly where he is. So while Luther is continuing to teach in the University of Wittenberg and continuing to write criticisms of the Pope and the practices of the Church, there's this series of responses that others are writing to him, other scholars, and even public debates. So in 1519, about a year later, in the city of Leipzig, there's a very public debate between Martin Luther and a guy called Johann Eck, who's a scholar and another Dominican friar. So another lifelong churchman, also scholarly. And Eck is going to defend the authority of the church as it is. He's sort of the church's man. So he wants to have this public debate where he's going to destroy Luther's ideas and try to humiliate him in front of an audience. And it's almost like an intellectual boxing match. I mean, people were actually traveling for miles to pack into this lecture hall and watch these two guys assail each other with words and ideas in public. It was very, very crowded, and there were partisans of Johann Eck who were in there to cheer on their man, and there were supporters of Luther in there doing exactly the same thing. It's hard to imagine today sort of a public debate attracting this much attention, but it makes more sense if you think of it as kind of MMA for the 1500s. Now, a lot of Luther's supporters expect him to make the defense that the Pope is subject to the authority of church councils. And you'll remember earlier on in the episode, we were talking about the Council of Trent, which was kind of in charge of fixing the problem of three popes. So this idea that sometimes when the Pope was making a mess of things, you needed to convene a council or a committee of ranking church members to sort things out, including sort out the Pope if necessary. And so a lot of Luther's supporters thought he is going to make this argument that the Pope isn't the highest authority. When necessary, church councils outrank him, and they are the source of deciding the truth of a question. But Luther shocks everybody by actually making a far more radical claim. And he doesn't talk about church councils at all. He says the Pope is subject to the Bible. This was unheard of. But in this moment, Luther is very publicly asserting an idea that's going to be at the core of the Protestant Reformation. So Luther had sort of four core tenets. He said sola fide, which is Latin for by faith alone. And that was the idea that he'd had when he was studying the Bible for that lecture and had his epiphany, which was, it doesn't matter how many prayers I say and how many penances I do, I can only achieve peace with God by faith in God's promises. That's it. So faith alone. This is first tenet. Then he's making the second statement, which is sola scriptura, by scripture alone. So he's now saying, when we're trying to understand what Christianity is and what it isn't, the text of the Bible is the ultimate authority. If we can find it in the Bible, then there's a reason for it. And if we can't, it has to go. It doesn't matter what the traditions of the church are, what the teachings of the church are, what the current Pope says or doesn't say. If we look in the text and don't find it there, there's no reason for it. So this is a radical assertion that he's making in this public debate. And it's going to be again and again repeated as one of the foundational ideas. And it's going to have huge implications, as we will see. Luther's other core tenets were sola Christus, or by Jesus Christ alone. And in this way, he was saying Jesus Christ only is the focus of people's faith and hope. And the entire panoply of saints and intercessors and all of these other figures that were part of church tradition were unnecessary. And finally, sola gratia, which is by grace alone. And so Luther is essentially saying there's nothing that any of us can do to deserve salvation or to satisfy God. We have to be living by faith and through grace. We have to be looking only at the Bible and at Jesus. Those are the things that are core, and everything else is expendable. Luther's insistence that the Bible is going to be the sole authority for everything sounds simple, and Luther thought it was. He really thought that anybody who was educated would look at the text and that the message of Scripture was clear. So as long as you were educated, if you read that book, you would come to exactly the same conclusions that he, Martin Luther, had. He thought the meaning was unambiguous and the message was clear. In this, he was deeply, deeply wrong. Because as time will show, many people have looked at that same text and come up with radically different ideas. But Martin Luther was the man who opened the door and put that text in people's hands and said, here, read it. Find out what it means for yourself. You'll know when you read it. Prior to Luther, there was no such opportunity because there was one channel of transmission for what people knew about Christianity and what it meant. And that channel was church tradition, as articulated by the popes and the teachings and doctrines of the church. They had access to the text, but the average person didn't. They just had this one channel of transmission where they were told exactly what Christianity was and how they ought to behave and practice and believe. But Luther essentially throws out the entire structure and he says, here's the text, figure it out for yourself. Of course, you'll see in it exactly what I did. Now, of course, prior to Luther, even if someone had come along with these ideas that people should read the Bible, it would have been nearly impossible because Bibles were very expensive and they were hand copied by scribes onto vellum and very expensive to produce, and there weren't many of them around. But in this moment, when Luther's coming out with this message, we now have the printing press. And so it's possible for the first time to mass produce books and to distribute them to a much larger section of the population. You didn't have to be incredibly wealthy to afford a hand-copied manuscript and have access to such a document. So Luther's emphasis on the text just happens to come at exactly the right moment when texts can be produced and disseminated more widely and more cheaply than ever before. There's still, of course, the translation problem, because the Bible at the time was mostly in Latin, and everyday people, merchants and bankers and these sorts of people would know how to read, but they would know how to read German, the language that they would be speaking and doing their business in. The language of Latin was for people who went to university, and they were mostly churchmen or nobles. So the Bible existed in Latin, and Luther could read it because he could read Latin. Most people, though they could read, did not read Latin. So there was a gap that was still to be filled, and Luther was going to set his attention to dealing with that problem. Luther's ideas and writings around the church had hardened in these 2 years after his initial 95 Theses. He was no longer speaking as a loyal son of the church who thought that if the higher-ups only knew what was going on, they would fix things. He'd been disabused of that idea and began to realize that the Pope and the cardinals would be willing to do just about anything they needed to do to maintain their own power and authority. And there were a couple of examples of this that are quite notable. The Pope had tried to silence the dissent that was growing in Germany as people were reading Luther's criticisms and repeating them. And he tried to tamp this down by offering certain honors to Frederick of Saxony. So listen, Frederick, get your people in order, shut them up, and in exchange we'll bestow on you this Order of the Golden Rose or this other sort of honor. So Frederick didn't take it, but the offer itself was made. And there were even rumors that the Pope was telling Frederick that, we actually need another cardinal to be appointed in Germany, and perhaps that bright young man at the University of Wittenberg, Martin Luther, could be appointed a cardinal. Martin Luther, the heretic, appointed a cardinal? Yes. This was a cynical attempt to shut down dissent by bribery. And so the Pope attempted to get Frederick to fall into line and enforce things by offering Frederick some reward and by allowing Frederick to appoint Martin Luther. Like, if you like Martin Luther so much, fine. You can make him you can invest him with a benefice in your territory because you're the prince. So if you want to make him a cardinal, we'll allow that in exchange, of course, for silence and loyalty and a retraction of these, difficult statements. So these were the carrots being offered in exchange for obedience. The carrots failed. So coming soon would be the sticks. But in the meantime, Martin Luther noticed that his old enemy, Johann Tetzel, that Dominican friar who had coined the indulgence slogans, Johann Tetzel was put on trial by the Pope's representative in Germany. Because after failing to shut down dissent by bribing Frederick and potentially Luther, the Pope decided, okay, let's publicly shame this Johann Tetzel guy. And that looks like we're doing something. So they put Tetzel on trial for stealing money, embezzlement, and sexual impropriety. And so Tetzel is disgraced, and he's soon after his health fails and he's dying. But Luther sees this as a very, very cynical episode because he says, listen, these people are not doing anything about the underlying, deeply wrong claims that you can buy an indulgence and the Pope can get you out of purgatory. They're not touching that because it's a source of money. So they're just going to sacrifice this one guy who happens to be their guy to sort of quiet dissent, and then they can carry on selling indulgences exactly as before. So Luther, in this remarkable moment, actually writes a letter to Tetzel, who's dying. Remember, Tetzel had been howling about getting Martin Luther burned at the stake. So he wasn't exactly a neutral party or anyone who was remotely friendly towards Luther. He's an enemy. But Luther writes him a letter basically saying, I know that you're not guilty of the things they put you on trial for, and you were a tool in the hands of men who had darker motivations. So it's this astonishing moment of kind of empathy and mercy for someone who'd been an enemy, where Luther says, listen, it's not you. It's this entire corrupt structure that's basically used you and has now disposed of you. And I bring this story up because Martin Luther is most often remembered for his angry writing and for some of the really terrible things he says about his enemies. But here's an example of him saying something quite different to a man who had been busy howling for his execution. The Pope finally condemns Luther formally with a papal bull or a kind of a pronouncement. And it lists specific statements from Martin Luther's writings. It labels them heretical, and Luther's given a short period of time to publicly recant. Otherwise, he's declared a heretic, and that means that he can be seized by any agent of the Pope at any time. And he's basically a wanted man. So Luther refuses to recant, and he actually publicly burns a copy of this papal bull or papal pronouncement that condemns him. So he sort of does this reversal where he burns the document, and then the Pope's representatives have the unenviable task of trying to carry this out, of burning Luther's writings once the grace period has expired, and putting up notices of him being a heretic. And so in Germany, this was a really unpopular activity because there was a lot of popular support for Luther. He's becoming a kind of a folk hero, and his followers are busy burning copies of the papal pronouncements. They're interfering with attempts to burn Luther's writings, and they're sometimes burning other writings instead. So the Pope's agents are meeting a whole lot of resistance on the ground in Germany. And in this year of 1520, the same year that he's officially condemned, Luther is going to produce some of his most influential writings. Historian Michael Massing puts it as follows, quote, over the next 6 months, Luther would produce 3 extraordinary texts, 3 thunderclaps. He had no army, no party, no movement, just a pen and the printing press. But with them, he would mount a headlong assault on a world order that had been in place for centuries. And I think that understanding the enormity of what Luther's doing and the size and age of the structure that he was busy attacking is really difficult to do. It's an enormous thing that's going on, and this is the best quote that I've come up with to sort of picture the gravity of this moment. Wittenberg becomes the exploding center of this movement that will later become called the Protestant Reformation. His ideas have taken root in the minds of people, and they're beginning to act on them. So one of the most obvious consequences of this is Luther saying there's no reason for celibacy. It's not in the Bible. These lives of celibate living as monks and nuns are needless. There's no value in it. So people are taking this idea, they're absorbing it, and then they're acting on it. So what it meant was monks and nuns began to leave their monasteries and their nunneries to abandon lives that they had vowed fidelity to. In 1525, Luther is asked to help 12 nuns who have fled from their convent. And the problem is that many of them are from these noble families, and their families feel they can't take them back because some of them live in other parts of Germany, not ruled by Prince Frederick. And they're very worried that if they take back these rebellious daughters, these rebel nuns, that they're going to displease the powers that be where they live, their own Catholic rulers. So the families don't want these women back. And there are 12 of them. So Luther needs to help because they're in this state in large part due to his teachings. They can't go back to their families, and he needs to find them husbands quickly in order to save both the women and himself from potentially ruinous gossip. So he's suddenly in this really odd position of finding himself like a matchmaker for these former nuns. And he succeeds in finding marriages for 11 of them, and there's just one left. And she's a 26-year-old young woman named Catherine von Bora. And she decides that she'd like to marry Martin Luther himself. By Luther's own account, Catherine proposed to him. This may or may not be the case. Some historians think it's pretty doubtful given how forceful and assertive Luther was in all the other areas of his life. But Luther had, up to this point, been saying that marriage wasn't for him. I mean, he was happy to say that there was no ground in the Bible for celibacy and no one needed to be celibate, but he hadn't shown any interest in getting married himself. And this could have been because in the initial years after his publication of the 95 Theses in 1517, to the point in 1520 where he's publicly declared a heretic and a wanted man, he sort of is living in the expectation of imminent arrest and sort of early death. So he might not have been thinking too far in the future in terms of partnering up and having children. And at this point in his life, in 1525, it's now been a few years. Being a rebel and being a heretic isn't a brand new thing. He's been in the business now for 7 years, 8 years. He's not dead yet. He's continuing to write. His ideas are increasing in the support that they're receiving. People are sending him letters. They're showing up and asking him for advice. People are expressing how much value they find in what he's doing. And so he's now 41 years old. And this young woman who's 26 needs a husband, and they agree that they're going to get married. Luther himself, in some of his writings shortly after his marriage, seems to have expressed some surprise at how pleasant married life really was. Because prior to Catherine coming into his life, he'd been sleeping on a pile of smelly skins or hay in the corner. He'd been living very much like a monk in a basically abandoned monastery where a lot of monks had left because they took his ideas seriously. But Luther was still there, living in the edifice of a monastery that was no longer functioning as a monastery. And so he talks about waking up in surprise to find pigtails on the pillow next to him, and about how nice it is to eat hot food and to sleep in a clean bed, how comfortable and how agreeable he finds it. In marrying Catherine, who's a former nun, it's the ultimate sort of example of Luther practicing what he preaches. If he's saying that no one needs to be celibate, he's now publicly abandoning the celibate lifestyle himself, and doing so in the company of a woman who's also abandoned a life as a nun. So while it's a personal domestic change, it's also a very public statement. One of Luther's major contributions is the frank recognition of normal and healthy sexual desire as having a place in Christian life. And again, this doesn't sound so strange to people today, but in the world that he lived in, the idea of virginity and celibacy was held up as sort of the moral ideal, that the Virgin Mary was the perfect woman because she had never had sex, and that the holiest people in society, your priests, your monks, your nuns, your bishops, the Pope, all of these people were supposed to be celibate. In practice, of course, as you already know, many of them weren't, but that was the ideal. So the point was, the teaching of the church was that a sexless life was a purer and holier life. And Luther rejects that wholesale. He says that there's absolutely nothing dirty or wrong with sexual desire in this context of being married. And he actually writes with very obvious enjoyment about physical intimacy with his wife. He's not bashful about it. He says that basically sex isn't a shameful thing, like sort of a weakness, that marriage is for the weak who are so overwhelmed with sexual desire that they would otherwise be sleeping with everybody, but that the ideal is to be celibate. He says this is ridiculous, and he has many quotes on the subject, but one of them goes like this. He says that sex is natural and, quote, "The Pope has as little power to command this chastity as he has to forbid eating and drinking, the natural movement of the bowels, or growing fat." Just basically saying sex is part of being human, and the idea that you can forbid people from doing it is absurd and unhealthy. Luther's frank enjoyment of a physical relationship with his wife comes through in his writings. It influences his teaching on the subject and is evident in the fact that his wife was very regularly pregnant and produced 6 children. Luther's reputation is inextricably bound up with his salty and vituperative language. So he writes with this very earthy sensibility about pretty much everything. The emptying of bowels, poop, scatological images come up with his writing quite a lot. But he's not someone who's afraid to be extremely blunt about whatever he thinks, whether he's talking about sex or he's talking about religion or he's talking about ideas that he disagrees with. And some of the things he said about the Pope, especially as time went on, got increasingly colorful. So here's a taste of this. In 1545, his anti-Pope stance had so hardened that he wrote a pamphlet entitled "Against the Papacy in Rome, Established by the Devil." So we've moved from the church is corrupt and it has some things we need to fix to the church as it exists is established by Satan himself. And he says in here, quote, "Praise God, no good Christian conscience can otherwise believe that the Pope is, or still can be today, the vice-regent of God or Christ, but is now the accursed church of every knave on the earth, a representative of the devil, an enemy of God, an adversary of Christ, and destroyer of the churches of Christ, teacher of all lying profanities and idolatries, an arch-thief of churches and church robbers of the keys, of all good things, both of churches and of earthly lords, a murderer of kings, and an inciter to all kinds of bloodshed, a lawbreaker above all lawbreakers, and all fornication, even which cannot be named, an antichrist, a man of sinners, and a child of perdition, a real werewolf." I'm not really sure where the werewolf part fits into the German imaginary, but you get the picture. The worst things that Luther can think about, the most awful things you could say, a servant of Satan, an antichrist, these are the things that he now labels the Pope with. Some of the more troubling things that Luther said, and the things that have caused the most consternation, have been his writings about Jews in Germany. And so I don't want to present a picture of Luther that's sort of hagiographical, and he's this perfect reformer who brings all these wonderful things in. There were things that Luther said and did that were seriously problematic, and his writings about Jewish people are perhaps the most troubling. So Luther's busy criticizing the Pope and the established church, but he's also busy criticizing Jewish people in Germany as being unwilling to convert to Christianity and to recognize the truth of the Bible as Luther sees it. He says things like, their synagogues and their houses should be burned, that Christians have no moral duties towards these people whatsoever. And some scholars have pointed to this moment as Luther bringing in existing anti-Semitic tendencies from the Middle Ages and basically ensuring that they transfer over into this new chapter of religious history that he's writing. Because these ideas Luther had about Jewish people weren't new. I mean, they were very widespread in Europe. Anti-Semitic ideas were common in the Middle Ages. The English kicked Jewish people out of their kingdom in the 1200s. The Spanish were busy doing it under Ferdinand and Isabella. I did a whole series on Ferdinand and Isabella and the Spanish Inquisition, which you can listen to on Villains and Virgins if you want to know more about that story. So these anti-Semitic ideas were circulating in Europe. They weren't new. Luther didn't invent them. But what he did was he carried them over from a set of traditions and ideas that he was busy destroying. He takes this idea and he preserves it and embeds it in his writings, which are going to become incredibly influential for Germany and for the future of Germany, which is as this Protestant, non-Catholic place where his ideas are formative. And one of these ideas is incredibly negative and hateful towards Jewish people. So this is an uncomfortable fact that lays some of the intellectual groundwork for things that happen in Germany in the centuries later. So I've been using the words the church throughout today's episode as a single unit, because up until Martin Luther, there was only one church in Western Europe. It wasn't the only Christian church in the world. In Eastern Europe and in Turkey and Greece, there was Orthodox Christianity, and that division happened much, much earlier in 1054. It's called the Great Schism. If you want to know more about that, there's another series of podcast episodes you can find on Villains and Virgins called the Great Schism. So apart from the Eastern half, in Western Europe, there's only one church. It is the Catholic Church. It is under the authority of the Pope, and it has all the hierarchical features I've described to you. But as Martin Luther's ideas begin to take off, we're going to see an extraordinary fragmentation. We're going to see the Christian community fracture and split off into smaller communities with different teachings in a way that had never happened before and would forever change everything about Christianity in the Western world. Because Luther puts this book in the hands of everybody and says, you read it and figure out what it means. And people came to very, very different conclusions about that. It was a sort of theological anarchy that he unleashed, because after getting rid of the one source of authority for what all this means, anybody could make a claim for what Christianity meant by pointing to verses in the Bible, and they could and did come up with very different pictures. So what begins to happen, even in Luther's lifetime, is the division of people into different communities with different ideas, all of them pointing to the Bible, but with radically different outcomes. There is so much that can be said about Martin Luther and the impact of his ideas that it's difficult to draw a line and limit what I'm going to cover here. But I have to wrap this up at some point and save other ideas I have for further episodes that are coming in this series. So I'm going to conclude with a brief description of how churches were transformed by Luther's ideas and why those ideas spread so rapidly. So I mentioned already the fragmentation of churches into communities that's already beginning to happen. And there was also this emphasis on those four solas that I earlier mentioned: by faith alone, by scripture alone, by grace alone, through Jesus Christ alone. So these become sort of the pillars of this new reformed idea of what Christianity is, and everything that doesn't connect to one of those is dispensed with. So the entire hierarchy of church positions of bishops and cardinals and popes gets set aside. The idea of praying to saints, over with. Many of the other rituals that were part of people's religious lives, things like saying prayers for the dead, were also abolished. Going on pilgrimage, finished. But Martin Luther had a very expansive view of the role of the Christian prince or king. Much like John Wycliffe before him, he thought that the only authority that could rival the popes was that of the king. And because the pope was not going to reform the church, it was the duty of the prince or the king to help do that. So the Christian prince, in Martin Luther's view, was liberated from the need to to listen to what the Pope in Rome had to say or to send money in that direction. So he could assume a much greater authority over the church in his territory, and he need not send any money from his territory to Rome. Instead of a centralized church authority under the Pope, Martin Luther saw national or local churches forming under the guidance of these princes. Congregations would read the Bible and decide for themselves what the text meant, but Luther was fairly confident that they would all arrive at conclusions that were similar to his own. Other changes that were notable was that congregations would now sing, because Luther thought that people should participate in the things that were being done in churches. There were changes to the way that the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper or the ritual of communion, these are all words for the same ritual, the bread and wine. There were going to be changes to how this ritual was performed that were dramatic, and people spilled a lot of ink and a lot of energy over discussing exactly how to understand this properly and how this ritual should be performed differently. Up to this point, the priest had kept the wine in a cup and held it up, and only the bread or the wafer would be distributed to the congregation. But now, everyone would be given both the bread and the wine. This was going to be a change in how this ritual was done. The most obvious and visible change was that churches were going to be stripped of their adornments. The stained glass, the statues, the icons, the paintings, the altar pieces, all of that was going to go. Because in this new idea of what Christianity was, the idea of images was equated with idolatry or the worship of false gods. And these reformers didn't want people focusing on a particular saint or on the Virgin Mary or on a picture of, Saint Sebastian being shot with arrows and thinking about these images. They wanted people to focus on more abstract and direct relationship with God. And so they thought that stripping away all of this art, all of these images, all of these adornments was necessary. And finally, there were great debates over baptism and whether infants should be baptized or whether that should be only performed on adults. And there was a lot of dispute in these newly formed communities over many of these questions and how they should do these things for themselves. The revolution happened with shocking speed. Within a decade of the publication of Luther's 95 Theses, the impact of his ideas had spread across Europe. People were reading them, they were talking about them, and they were changing their lives as a result. New congregations of these reformers or Lutherans were springing up in Wittenberg and also in other parts of Europe. This revolution, the spread of Martin Luther's ideas and their impact, was enabled by three factors. Number one, the shelter and protection provided by Prince Frederick of Saxony. Without his shelter, Martin Luther's career and the spread of his ideas would likely have been far, far shorter. Number two, the role of the newly invented printing press, which allowed the cheap and rapid dissemination of ideas on a scale that had never before been seen. So this allowed these ideas to spread much, much farther and much faster than ever before. You can think of the impact of the printing press as equivalent to the internet of its time. That prior to the internet, for us, ideas would spread more slowly. You'd be writing letters instead of sending emails. You'd be going to the library and taking out physical books. Whereas now you can access all these ideas at your fingertips through a device. So ideas spread at a speed that is unprecedented because of the internet for us today. The impact of the printing press in its time was similar in terms of the quantum leap in the speed that ideas could travel, and therefore the impact they could have. And finally, the third factor was the long-standing resentment of corruption in the church. This had been simmering for several centuries. There had been people who had spoken out at various points publicly in writing and had often paid a high price to do so. But the silencing of these voices hadn't made the problems go away. And so this ongoing anger and disgust that was widespread across Europe created the conditions that were absolutely perfect for these ideas to take root. You can think of it as a forest that hadn't seen rain in years. It was a tinderbox. And when Luther's ideas landed, it was a match that burst into flames that spread everywhere. But like any wildfire, once you set that tinderbox alight, you can't control where the destruction is going to go. So too, with the ideas that were unleashed by Martin Luther, a chain of events followed that even Luther himself would have been horrified by. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Villains and Virgins podcast. To know more about the impact of Luther and where those ideas raged, stay tuned for episode 3 in this series. Make sure you subscribe so that you know the minute that episode comes out. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with someone else that you think would also appreciate it. You can catch this podcast wherever you listen to audio. It's available on Spotify and Apple and Amazon and wherever you listen. And it's also available in video on YouTube. Thank you so much, and hopefully I'll see you in the next episode.